usually begins by telling a small story, the kind that seems simple, but reveals something deep. Years ago, during an important meeting, he was watching two people discussing a proposal. The room was full, the atmosphere tense, and it only took one provocative sentence to ignite the spark. One of the participants reacted immediately. He interrupted, raised his voice, started explaining why that criticism made no sense. He seemed confident, but something in his posture revealed urgency. But here's something curious. While everyone was paying attention to the person speaking, almost no one noticed who was actually winning the dynamic of the room. On the other side of the table there was someone who practically said nothing. He just listened, looked into the eyes of the person speaking, paused briefly before any response. Few people notice this, Wayne. But that person's silence began to change the atmosphere of the conversation. When he finally spoke, he didn't raise his voice, didn't try to crush the other person's argument. He simply asked a simple question, the kind that crosses the room like a silent blade. And then something interesting happens. The energy of the discussion changes. The person who had been dominating the debate begins to explain himself, to justify himself, almost as if he had lost his balance. There is a hidden revelation here. In human interactions, most people believe power comes from quick reaction. But in practice, the one who reacts first often gives away emotional control of the situation. He has seen this happen in negotiations, family discussions, debates on social media. Always the same pattern. Someone provokes, someone reacts, and someone observes. This is where the psychological dynamic changes, because in that small gap between hearing and responding there is an invisible space, a space few people enter, but where true emotional intelligence begins to appear. And when someone learns to use that space, something very different begins to happen in conversations. There is a curious moment in almost everyone's life. A moment when you realize that many of the discussions you had were never really about reason or truth. They were about reaction. Maybe you've felt this before. Someone says something provocative. You respond immediately. The conversation escalates. And suddenly everything turns into a conflict that seemed inevitable. But here's something curious. Few people realize that the psychological game was already decided the moment the first emotional reaction appeared. Few people notice this. But much of the power in human interactions is not in the words we say. It's in the control we have over what we feel before we speak. There is a hidden revelation here. Emotionally dominant people rarely need to raise their voice, rarely need to prove they are right. And then something interesting happens. When someone learns to control their own reaction, social dynamics begin to change almost immediately. Provocations lose strength, discussions lose intensity, and the person begins to notice something that previously seemed invisible. This is where the psychological dynamic changes. Because the moment you understand that emotional control is power is not just an interesting idea. It's a transformation in the way you experience conversations, conflicts, and relationships. And throughout this video, he will reveal something few people truly learn. How to develop the kind of mental control that completely changes the way people react to you. He usually clarifies something right at the beginning, because many people completely misunderstand this concept. Emotional intelligence does not mean always being kind, smiling all the time, or avoiding every conflict. But here's something curious. Many people have started believing that being emotionally intelligent simply means being nice. And nothing could be further from reality. Emotional intelligence in practice means something far more powerful. Not allowing another person to control your emotional state. Few people notice this. But the moment someone manages to provoke your automatic reaction, that person has just gained a small psychological advantage in the interaction. He usually gives a simple example that almost everyone has experienced. Imagine an online discussion. Someone writes a provocative, slightly sarcastic comment. You feel that immediate impulse to respond, explain, correct. And then something interesting happens. The more you try to prove your point, the more emotionally involved you become. There is a hidden revelation here. Many provocations are not made to discuss ideas, but to provoke reaction. The person provoking is usually calm, observing. The person reacting enters the emotional game without realizing it. This is where the psychological dynamic changes, because the debate stops being rational and becomes emotional. Great strategists in history deeply understood this difference. One example often cited is Niccolò Machiavelli. He observed that power rarely belongs to the loudest person in the room, but often to the one who understands human emotions, both their own and those of others. But here's something curious. This is not just ancient philosophy. In the modern world, leaders, negotiators, and great communicators apply exactly the same principle. They know that before controlling any external situation, it is necessary to master the internal state. And when this understanding begins to become clear, an inevitable question arises. At what exact moment do people lose this control? He usually says that almost no one notices the exact moment when they lose emotional control. It doesn't happen with shouting nor with a dramatic explosion. It happens in something much more subtle. A sentence crosses the conversation, a comment with a slightly provocative tone, and suddenly that urgent need to respond appears. But here's something curious. That impulse to respond immediately almost never comes from logic. It comes from the ego trying to defend itself. Few people notice this. But at that moment, the conversation stops being about ideas and becomes about emotional protection. He remembers a curious situation that happened during an online discussion. A simple comment appeared. That doesn't make much sense. Nothing aggressive, nothing extremely offensive. Even so, within seconds, someone began writing an entire paragraph defending their position. And then something interesting happens. The more the person writes, the more emotionally involved they become. There is a hidden revelation here. Many provocations function as an invisible invitation to a psychological boxing ring. And the curious part is that whoever accepts this invitation almost never realizes they have entered an emotional dispute. This is where the psychological dynamic changes. Because strategists understand something most people ignore. Not every provocation deserves an immediate response. He usually compares it to someone pulling you into a boxing ring in the middle of the street. If you enter automatically, the game has already begun on the other person's terms. But here's something curious. When someone simply observes before reacting, something unexpected happens. The other person loses a bit of control over the situation, and that small pause, almost invisible, begins to reveal something even deeper about how the human brain actually reacts under pressure. He usually explains something that completely changes the way people understand conflicts. In most social situations, the brain reacts before reason appears. It may sound strange, but that's exactly how it works. When someone provokes us, interrupts us, or questions our competence, the brain interprets it as a small threat. But here's something curious. The body reacts in milliseconds. The heart speeds up, the mind tries to find a quick response, and that almost automatic urge to defend yourself appears. Few people notice this. But in that moment, the one speaking is not logic, it's instinct. He remembers a common situation that many people have experienced. Imagine someone criticizing your work in front of others. Before even thinking calmly, the mind already starts forming defensive responses, explaining, justifying, countering. And then something interesting happens. The faster the reaction, the greater the chance the response will be emotional rather than strategic. There is a hidden revelation here. The human brain was programmed to react quickly to threats, because for thousands of years that meant survival. The problem is that in modern conversations, this mechanism often creates more conflicts than it solves. This is where the psychological dynamic changes. Because strategically intelligent people develop a small habit that seems simple, but is extremely powerful. They pause. Not because they don't know how to respond, but because they choose to think before reacting. But here's something curious. That pause, even if it lasts only 3 or 4 seconds, completely changes how people around perceive the situation. Those observing begin to interpret it as calm, control, and confidence. And when someone learns to use that small space between stimulus and response, they begin to discover a type of psychological power that most people never notice. He usually says something that always surprises people the first time they hear it. Sometimes a few seconds of silence say more about power than an entire speech. But here's something curious. When someone pauses before responding, other people's minds automatically begin interpreting that as confidence. It may sound strange, but it happens all the time. Few people notice this. Most people respond too quickly because they feel the need to prove they know, that they understand, that they are prepared. But that urgency often communicates exactly the opposite. Anxiety. He remembers observing this during a job interview. The interviewer asked a difficult question, the kind that requires reasoning. One candidate responded immediately, almost stumbling over the words. Another stayed silent for a few seconds, breathed, organized the thought, and then answered calmly. And then something interesting happens. Even if both gave similar answers, the perception in the room was completely different. There is a hidden revelation here. When someone demonstrates that they can think before speaking, it transmits a sense of mental mastery. It seems like someone who is not being pressured by the situation. This is where the psychological dynamic changes, because the pause is not just silence. It is strategy. He usually suggests something very simple for anyone who wants to develop this habit. Whenever someone asks a difficult question, take a deep breath and mentally count to 3 before answering. It seems small, but it creates immediate mental clarity. But here's something curious. After someone begins practicing this, something unexpected happens. Conversations become more balanced, decisions become smarter, and even conflicts begin to lose intensity. And when someone notices the effect of this small habit, they begin to understand why so many people get into arguments that could have been avoided. He usually tells the story of a coworker who had an impressive ability. He never let an argument pass. Any comment turned into a debate. Any disagreement turned into a battle of arguments. At first it even seemed admirable. Someone articulate, quick, always ready to defend their ideas. But here's something curious. Over time, people began to avoid talking to him. Few people notice this. Those who try to win every argument end up losing something far more important, the reputation of balance. And then something interesting happens when this pattern repeats many times. The person begins to feel mentally exhausted. Coworkers begin to see them as difficult, and simple conversations start carrying tension. There is a hidden revelation here. Many discussions do not exist to be won, they exist only to test reactions. He remembers a common situation in the workplace. Someone makes a light provocation, almost as if testing the temperature. If the other person reacts intensely, that's it. The dynamic of conflict has already begun. And often there was never a real problem there. This is where the psychological dynamic changes. Social strategists understand something very different. They don't enter every battle. They choose when to play. He often uses a simple analogy. Arguing about every detail of life is like fighting for every inch of territory on a map. You may even win some battles, but you will spend too much energy in the process. But here's something curious. When someone learns to ignore unnecessary discussions, something unexpected happens. People begin to notice that this person only speaks when it truly matters, and that, silently, increases the weight of every word spoken. Topic 07. How to develop strategic emotional coldness. 29-35 man. He usually explains that developing emotional control is not something mystical or reserved for naturally calm people. It is a mental training almost like strengthening an invisible muscle. But here's something curious. Most people try to control their reaction after they have already reacted. In other words, they try to put out the fire after it has already spread. Few people notice this. Real control begins a few seconds before the response. There is a hidden revelation here. Whoever learns to observe first reacts in a completely different way. And that completely changes how people perceive their presence in a conversation. He usually teaches an extremely simple but powerful method that can be used in any social situation. 3 steps. Observe, interpret, respond with intention. First, observe what is really happening. The tone of voice, the intention behind the words, body language. Then interpret, is that really an attack or just a different opinion? And then something interesting happens. When someone goes through this small mental process, the response stops being impulsive and becomes strategic. This is where the psychological dynamic changes, because the conversation stops being an emotional reaction and becomes a conscious choice. He usually suggests something very practical for anyone who wants to develop this habit. During difficult conversations, ask yourself a small mental question before responding. Which response actually strengthens my position here? It sounds simple, but it changes everything. But here's something curious. When someone begins applying this small mental filter, conflicts decrease, decisions become clearer, and that person's presence begins to communicate something different. People start to perceive calm, clarity, stability, and without realizing it, whoever develops this type of control begins to enter a psychological territory that few people truly master. He usually pauses here because many people understand this concept superficially. Emotional intelligence is not the absence of feelings. It is not becoming a cold, distant, or indifferent person. But here's something curious. Many people confuse emotional control with emotional repression. They think mastering emotions means not feeling anything. Few people notice this. True emotional mastery is not eliminating emotions. It is not allowing them to decide for you in the heat of the moment. There is a hidden revelation here. Feeling is human, but choosing how to act after feeling is a skill. He remembers observing leaders who had something in common. In situations of pressure, when everyone around seemed nervous or irritated, they remained calm. Not because they didn't feel tension, but because they knew how to manage it. And then something interesting happens. When a person remains stable in moments of pressure, they begin to become a reference point for others. People naturally start looking at them when they need direction. This is where the psychological dynamic changes. Calm stops being just an emotional state and begins to become a form of silent leadership. But here's something curious. The emotionally strongest people rarely seem like the most aggressive in the room. Often they are exactly the opposite. They speak less, observe more, carefully choose when to act. There is a phrase that summarizes this idea well. The strongest person in the room is usually the calmest one. Few people notice this until they start truly observing human behavior. And when someone deeply understands this principle, they begin to see conversations, conflicts, and relationships in a completely different way. He usually ends this reflection by reminding something that almost no one notices in everyday life. Most people believe power in a conversation comes from speaking louder, arguing better, or responding faster. But here's something curious. Often real power appears in exactly the opposite of that. Few people notice this. The person who truly dominates a situation is usually not trying to prove anything all the time. They are simply observing, understanding the moment, and carefully choosing when to act. There is a hidden revelation here. Emotional control creates something that few people develop: psychological presence. When someone learns to react less and observe more, they begin to notice patterns that previously went unnoticed. And then something interesting happens. Discussions stop feeling like personal battles and begin to look like human dynamics unfolding in front of your eyes. This is where the psychological dynamic changes. The person stops being dragged by the emotions of the environment and begins navigating situations with much more clarity. But here's something curious. When someone begins to master their own emotional state, something even more powerful emerges. Other people start reacting to you differently. Respect appears where there was once provocation. Conversations become more balanced, and often, conflicts simply stop existing. Few people notice this, but those who control their own emotions often end up controlling the entire situation without needing to raise their voice. And when this realization finally settles in someone's mind, the way they deal with people never becomes the same again. Now, a sincere question is worth asking. How many arguments in your life really needed to happen? And how many began simply because someone reacted too quickly? Think about that for a moment. But here's something curious. Many situations that drain us emotionally do not start with big conflicts. They start with small provocations, subtle comments, sideways glances, and then something interesting happens. Most people react automatically, without realizing they have just handed over emotional control of the situation. Few people notice this. But true emotional intelligence begins exactly at the moment you decide not to react impulsively. There is a hidden revelation here. When you master your reaction, you completely change the dynamic of the interaction. This is where the psychological dynamic changes. Suddenly, you are no longer being pulled by the emotions of the environment. You begin choosing when to speak, when to ignore, when to respond, and sometimes when to simply observe in silence. And interestingly, that is the moment when people's respect begins to appear naturally. Now think with me. What if you started applying this already in your next conversations, in the next meeting, the next debate, the next provocative comment that appears in your day? How would your posture change if, instead of reacting, you simply observed first? But here's something curious. Small internal changes tend to create enormous transformations in how the world reacts to you. If this type of psychological strategy makes sense to you and you want to continue learning how to develop mental control, emotional intelligence, and psychological presence in human interactions, then do the following. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Because here we explore exactly these principles that few people teach, but that can completely transform the way you deal with people and situations.